Here on FlowFM across regional Australia, great to be chatting with the National Farmers Federation. We've got Charlie Thomas, the General Manager of Corporate Affairs, with us. How are you, Charlie?
Very well, thanks, Ricky. Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. Much appreciated, in fact. And we very good times here when it comes to agriculture and just what we're producing in Australia. There's always challenges, and the NFF's highlighted some off the back of an ABARES report recently.
Yeah, correct. So, firstly, the good news is that we've recorded very close to another record season for agriculture this financial year. So looking at another total value of farm production just over 80 billion, which is just fantastic off the back of that rain and some good commodity prices. But what we've been keen to point out off the back of that is just the challenges that a lot of farmers are facing in terms of input costs in particular. So we're saying it's a real cost of farming crunch that's probably getting concealed by some of these headline figures. Things like the cost of fertiliser, the cost of fuel. Obviously, as many people would know, the cost of land is absolutely on a rocket ride to the moon, and it's creating problems. And problems are getting concealed by these good prices, but you've got to think about what this means when potentially, markets return to normal, seasons return to normal. How sustainable will this be for family farms going forward?
And naturally, I guess as a lobbying group, when it comes to speaking to governments and oppositions, you've got probably a few things you want to push the federal government to be doing in this front. I think, for instance, when you talk about land values, that brings a concern that council rates may go up, but then there's a whole lot more coming off the land and impacting the roads in the absence of, rail infrastructure. So it's sort of a cyclical problem that we need some investment to resolve.
It is, and look, we don't pretend that these are easy problems to solve, and a lot of them are, of course, completely outside the control of government. But what we're having conversations with the new government federally about is just where they can influence these things. So, looking at things like the cost of our supply chains and the quality of infrastructure that we've got to move our things from paddock to port efficiently. We're hoping that the new government's going to continue a fairly strong pipeline of infrastructure investment in the regions, certainly something that we're pushing them hard on. The other thing is just those international supply chains. So the cost of freight and shipping globally has gone absolutely through the roof, and it's creating a lot of pressure on our exporters. And there are some simple things that can be done in terms of modernisation of our wharf infrastructure. Looking at some of the industrial relations issues that exist on the wharves. Those sorts of things are sort of easy-ish levers that the government can pull if they've got the appetite.
Yeah, when you mention the on-water issues there, it reminds me of some commentary Labor made fairly early in the campaign about developing a strategic fleet, about having, I guess, more Australian ships that could perhaps fulfil a role if those ships from international cruiser end up diverted elsewhere.
Yeah, it was an interesting proposal. I don't know how much further thinking's been done on that, but I think it's something that's probably a bit of a theme throughout what this government's talked about during the campaign period, in just doing more for ourselves and being a little bit more self-reliant as a country. And that's something that we're very focused on, particularly when it comes to some of these key inputs, things like fertiliser and chemicals. At the moment we're almost entirely dependent on the Chinese market for critical chemicals, and we just need to think more carefully as a country about what we can possibly be doing here. Obviously, the economic realities of that are challenging, but the government has allocated $500 million, committed $500 million from its National Reconstruction Fund towards these sorts of projects, whether it's value adding in agriculture or key inputs for agriculture. So we're starting those discussions now with the government about how that money will be spent, and we're hoping that there can be some really practical projects that have long-term benefits for the industry.
You implied a bit earlier about the masking, I guess, of the outcomes for farmers when it came to the input costs that might erode their gains. But is there another masking happening in terms of the price? We've got this farm gate value target of yours, the National Farmers Federation, $100 billion by 2030. But are international prices kind of helping us get there a bit quicker than the underlying value for our actual agricultural produce?
Yeah, well, certainly the gains that we've seen are largely through increased value, not increased production. That's absolutely the case. But that's not to say that that's not sustainable long term. The reality is there are more and wealthier people around the world demanding our products, and we do see some level of raised prices being sustained in the long term. Whether that's at the levels that we're currently seeing, probably not. There are some pretty unique factors driving that at present. But I think that headline target that we've got, that 100 billion by 2030, I mean, it's a nice catchphrase, but it's actually not very meaningful at the sort of individual farm gate level. What's more important there is profitability, obviously, and some of the other things that we're shooting for in that strategy around, sustainability of farm businesses, the trust that the community has in the industry, the ability to attract and retain quality workers, these sorts of things that make farming, not just more productive and more profitable, but more enjoyable for people in the industry as well.
Yeah, just want to ask her something about biosecurity in a moment, but you just mentioned, I guess, attracting workers. Where are we going to go now with this agricultural visa scenario with a new Labor government?
Look, well, we were obviously pretty disheartened by the decision by the Labor Party during the campaign to roll what was a really important program for agriculture into a subset of what's called the PALM, the Pacific Island Labour Mobility Scheme. What we're hoping, and we're trying to remain optimistic on this, is that they will continue to want an MOU that was signed with Vietnam. So, keeping at least one of those ASEAN countries involved in the program rather than just purely limiting it to the Pacific Island nations. And perhaps over time, we can compare the success of the various, outcomes from those Vietnamese workers potentially and the Pacific workers, and have a case to expand that further down the track. The reality is, with unemployment at record lows, we're not going to end this crisis using Australian workers. We do need the involvement of visiting workers from overseas. So that reality will set in for the current government, and we're hopeful that they'll continue to have some constructive discussions about how we make it easier to get people in.
Well, I imagine, in effect, what we're trying to do is demonstrate that farmers aren't perhaps what some unions are saying they are in terms of exploiting workers, and once the workers are on the ground and treated well on farms, there'll be less nervousness from Labor about expanding that perhaps to other countries.
Well, and that was one of the key benefits of the proposed ag visa that, well, not proposed, but was in place, but yet to have anyone arrive, was that it was all about making sure that workers were protected, making sure that they had a positive experience on farm. And that was something that we as the NFF had pushed really hard for, because we recognise that unless we can demonstrate that positive experience for people coming to Australia, we're not going to maintain access to these workers. So it's it's a priority for us. It's a priority for the new government, and I think we should be able to agree on some sort of framework that brings people in, keeps them safe, and makes sure they have a good experience.
Now, on those ABARES figures, we spoke with Executive Director Dr. Jaron Greenfield recently about those, and talked about this threat of foot and mouth disease from Indonesia potentially, which he says could wipe $80 billion over 10 years, which on those figures we've just had is equivalent to a year's worth of production for across the whole farming sector. David Littleproud, now the former Ag Minister, said they had motion in place to create a biosecurity levy, in effect a cost recovery model on imports to protect against, I guess, or make sure biosecurity is recurrently funded. What is the NFF's concerns around, those sort of biosecurity threats in livestock?
Well, our primary concern is that simply not enough sustainable funding is being thrown at this problem. The previous government had sort of indicated in the dying days of the campaign that they were committed to introducing some sort of levy. They'd attempted this once before and been scared off by the importers who took offence to the proposal. But that's exactly what's needed. We've got a skyrocketing number of, containers. Prior to COVID, we had a huge increase, over multiple years in the number of human travellers coming to Australia, and the biosecurity funding stayed the same. So we need something that actually grows when the quantity of the threat grows, as the amount of inbound cargo and people grows. Until we have that in place, we really can't be sure that we're actually keeping pace with the issue. And the actual threat itself is, as you've already mentioned, getting exponentially worse as you see things like lumpy skin and foot and mouth in places as close as Indonesia. It's really concerning for the industry.
All right, Charlie Thomas, Corporate Affairs General Manager for National Farmers Federation. Thanks so much for joining us, covering a lot of topics there today. Great to have you with us.
Pleasure, Ricky. Thanks for the chat.